Normally, I don't really believe in things that go bump in the night, or even things in the paranormal realm, but I can't dismiss how incredibly creepy and eerie this one night was when I worked for the Forest Service industry. It was in the evening time, and I was informed by a group of young kids in their early 20s, probably college age, that their friend had been missing since noon. They hadn't been able to find him, and they asked me for help. They said they were hiking along the trail, and they pointed to me the trailhead. They asked if I could help look for him. I explained to them that it is very common for someone to easily wander off the trail in search of going to the bathroom or maybe exploring, and very easily losing their sense of direction if they don't have a compass or any form of equipment that will help keep them on track. As we began our search, it was just now getting dark, just about sundown, as we got about 2 miles down the trail, heading to the spot where they said to have lost him. We all heard audible screaming to our 3 o'clock. I veered off the trail, letting them follow behind me if they wanted to, but I think they stayed behind. They did not have the adequate equipment, and it wasn't safe. So I go down there, and I hear this screaming, yelling for help. I figured it's the lost hiker, so I keep going in a little ways, keep searching more and more through the forest. At this point in the path, in the woods, it's very dense, so I have to kind of make my way the best I can. I'm getting closer and closer to the screaming, and it's very clear that the person screaming is in distress, and they're screaming for help. I get closer, and it sounds like this person is only maybe 30 meters away at most. And then I come to a small clearing, where the screaming and yelling has now ceased entirely. I looked around, didn't see anything, didn't see any more signs of anybody being in the area or yelling for help. But I did find something disturbing. In the middle of the clearing was a large pine tree with what appeared to be a very weathered, dirty old human skull, just casually sitting there at the base of the tree. Upon my finding, I radioed it in, and before we know it, we had an entire team out here looking for this lost hiker. I'll spare you all the irrelevant details, but it turns out the lost hiker had only wandered off the trail maybe a quarter of a mile, and being a good hiker and knowing proper technique, he stayed put, and did lose all sense of direction, by the way. But here's what doesn't make sense. He wandered off way later on in the trail, off to our 9 o'clock, not at all in the same direction or area that I had heard the screaming or yelling from. But here's the kicker. While I made this statement about the whole paranormal thing at the beginning of my story, I was told that the skull that was found at the base of that pine tree, maybe no more than a half-mile off trail, actually belonged to a 39-year-old male hiker who had disappeared 3 years prior and was never found. Upon digging around that area in search of his remains, no other parts of his clothing, bag, equipment, or body was ever uncovered. Just his skull, casually sitting there at the base of the pine tree, as if somebody had found it and sat it there. I have no answers as to who was screaming and why they were yelling for help. It did sound like an adult male, and it sounded like that screaming and yelling was coming from that exact clearing that I found the skull. There had been no other reports of anybody missing, and nobody else had been hiking in that area of the trail. Nobody would be out there in the middle of the woods without the right equipment. It just made my entire skin crawl. I'm not going to claim to be the most knowledgeable and experienced park ranger there have been, but I've definitely seen my fair share of craziness being on the job. Everything from dead junkies to crazy search and rescue parties. You name it, I've probably seen it. Even though only working in the career field for 9 years, I saw more than enough to get my fill. So in order to pursue school, I had to quit the job. I saw many horrific things that I will never be able to unget out of my memory. But there are other things that I encountered that will always shake me because there's no reasonable explanation for what I heard or what I saw. In fact, I can tell you many of them, but one that sticks out to me is finding certain dead animals in very specific conditions For example, I once found a black bear, dead, in the middle of a small clearing. After searching for clues to how it died, it had a large gaping hole punched into its chest. Something with immense force punched a hole in this black bear's chest and ripped out its heart, dislocating and ripping open its ribcage entirely. That's something that I had no idea how to explain away, and it made me incredibly apprehensive into going into certain parts of the forest like I was supposed to, especially during my routine patrol routes. I'll never forget that after that specific day, the entirety of the deer population in that small area seemed to vanish entirely, and I would always feel like I was being heavily watched when I'd go through that small section of forest, like something was just beyond the reach of me in the trees, watching me. I always tried to be quiet, keep a lookout, make sure there was nothing following me or around me, and of course I never saw anything, but I could never shake the feeling, and I never did exactly find out why I felt so uncomfortable. I even had a colleague brush it off and tell me that there's pot growers out there, and that's why I felt so uncomfortable. Except a pot grower does not punch a hole in a black bear's chest and rip out its heart. I had some other colleagues who were a little bit older and wiser. They'd been on the job for a while. They always told me to be careful in that specific section of the forest as I patrolled. I could never get anything specific out of them, like what or why. I'd even told them my experiences with the black bear, which many of them were not surprised, and they reported too, having similar findings of such disturbing nature, always being extremely careful to what they would reveal to me and what they would keep hidden. So I never found out exactly. I have so many stories that, if I wanted to, I could sit down and write to you. So I think I might take some time and sit down and take a trip down memory lane. But, for the time being, just know that it's probably not the greatest idea to just go randomly waltzing into the forest. Even we forest rangers are aware that there's things in the woods we should be concerned about. We have a friend who's a volunteer who does search and rescue in the Australian outback, involved in wildlife rescue, bushfire management, etc. He had received a call about a couple of tourists who got in their heads that they could load up a little rented car with some snacks and tunes, drive it across the Australian bush. Some romantic idea about driving from Western Australia to the Northern Territory, looking for kangaroos in their habitat, foraging for native plants as bush tucker. No understanding of the rough terrain, isolation, good luck finding a gas station, and how cold the bush becomes at night. Their friends had not heard from them in several days. My friend is near Alice Springs, which is one of the locations they could have ended up. It's a lot of ground to cover, but he does his part and spends the day just driving around on dirt roads. Gets past familiar farms into the real outback, just miles of red dust and dry air. Doesn't find a broken down car, tourists, or anything but endless trees and shrubs. It's getting dark, so he turns around to head home. On his way back, he notices something about one of the low-growing trees that he did not discern before. Hair. Human hair. Tufts of blonde hair are twisted around its branches. It's probably too light to be from indigenous people, and there is not a known tribe on that land regardless. He slows down. More hair. At least a dozen trees are decorated with locks of blonde hair, and he can't tell if they're speckled with red dirt or blood. When the gravity of the situation truly sunk in, he floored it. Frantically, radioing in to the shack in town, says he probably sounded crazy or drunk. Lived in the country all his life, but swears that he'll never visit the outback at night again, without another volunteer accompanying him. I was attached to a technical search and rescue team after Hurricane Irma impacted my county. Basically, we were the crews that go out after the winds die down, and clear roads, search damaged structures, just to make sure everybody is okay, and even tend to those who are not. My county is one of the largest in the state of Florida, so each team had multiple large grids to search through, and that means going up and down every single street in every single neighborhood so that everything is covered and you don't miss a thing. So it took all day just to do a couple of grids. At one point, my team had up on a home with a large tree that had fallen onto the roof. Like all the other large trees on roofs in the area, we would walk up, survey the damage, see if anybody was inside, and report it back. Nobody was home, so we just reported it and moved on. Went further down the road, but it was all flooded out, so we had no choice but to turn around and come back the way we came, passing the house above. On our way back around, the family, parents and 2 young children, had just gotten back from evacuating further inland, so we stopped and chatted with them for a bit. Called in some linemen to take care of the power, since there was a power line that went down. They invited us in to do some paperwork so we could connect them with social services and get them to a safe place to stay until their home situation is sorted out. While inside, we got a closer look at where exactly the tree had fallen. It was right above their kids' shared bedroom. The kids both slept in a bunk bed in a room in the corner of the house where the tree had fallen. The tree in question had a branch which penetrated the roof and ceiling of the room and had also gone clean through both the top and the bottom bunks. Had the family not evacuated, that tree fallen while those kids were in bed, since the storm came through overnight in the area, those 2 young kids would have been impaled in their sleep and more than likely lost their lives. They were very lucky deciding to evacuate, even though they're not in any evacuation or flood zone. After all the reports were in, overall, our county only had about 500 structures damaged from either wind, debris, or water. So we all lucked out compared to some of the other parts of the state, and especially since nobody in our county was killed. We got pretty darn close. I'll keep this brief, but I used to do some pretty heavy-duty search and rescue operations back in the early 2000s, and while there are many stories that stand out to me, one, in particular, of a little 4-year-old boy named Cody Rowler, his disappearance will always shake me. Here's why. He was just spending the day with his family, his mom, dad, and older brother, when the parents turned their backs on him, and the next second he was gone. A search was put out, and the entire area was surveyed for miles and miles. Well, after 9 days, he was not found. But on the 10th day, 19 miles away, high up on a cliff, in over a 70-foot tall pine tree, his shoes had been discovered, completely clean, as if the day he had been lost. We were able to confirm with the family that these shoes were indeed his. Again, completely clean, as if they were brand new and had never been worn. As it turns out, the parents just bought him those shoes days before he went missing. They were a small pair of Nikes. I don't remember the size, but on the bottom of the left shoe, written in blue Sharpie, was his name, Cody Rowler, which is exactly how we were able to properly identify those shoes. I don't know how much you've ever read of any of the missing 411 stories, but this was my own personal missing 411 story. How a young 4-year-old boy went 19 miles in a 10-day span and never once got his shoes dirty, while going up a 100-plus foot steep cliff, and even up more, a 70-tall foot pine tree. Nothing else of him was ever discovered. Only his shoes. That was honestly probably one of the hardest days on the job, having to tell the family what we had found. I believe the year is 2002, but it could have been 2003. It was somewhere right in that window of time. And to think, after all these years, those memories will never leave you.